If you think that at times Jesus' teachings are difficult to understand, imagine what the disciples must have been thinking when they heard this exchange today. Jesus was just telling them that he was going to give them the keys to the kingdom. And whatever they bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever they loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And now 3 verses later he tells them that they must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. First the keys, and now the cross. If I'd been one of Jesus' disciples, I would have thought to myself, which is it going to be here, Jesus? Is it going to be the keys, or is it going to be the cross? I believe in context here that it's best to understand that Jesus is telling them that they're to have both. And I'll explain why. But first I want to touch on good old Peter, because he is such a piece of work. He'd just been praised by Jesus. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Why? Because he had just confessed that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God. And now just a few verses later, Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me." Can you imagine the Son of God, the Christ, telling you you're a hindrance to his ministry? And the faux pas don't stop there. In 6 days, Jesus will take 2 other disciples with Peter to the Mount of Transfiguration. And Peter will wrongly suggest that they build some tents and stay there, even though Jesus had just been telling them that they must go to Jerusalem and he must suffer and die and be raised on the 3rd day. The very next day, presumably Peter among them, a discussion breaks out among the wise disciples about which of them is going to be the greatest. Then Peter comes to Jesus and says, "Do I really have to forgive my brother 7 times? And Jesus says, "No, 7 times 70. And then it really goes downhill from there. Peter falls asleep while Jesus is praying in Gethsemane. He pulls out a sword and cuts off the servant's ear when they're arresting Jesus. And then lastly, he denies Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. Daniel Powder had a catchy little tune that had in it, "So you had a bad day?" That could kind of be Peter's theme song at this point of his life. I find this story refreshing, though. First of all, I think it shows the reliability of Holy Scriptures. I mean, if the apostles were making this stuff up, they would have made themselves look a lot better in the story than they do. I mean, there are even points that you can see in the story where even Jesus gets frustrated with his own disciples and says, "How much longer am I going to be with you guys?" Peter gives me hope for my journey, because he's a real example, I think, a real example. It doesn't matter how many times you fall down or you get knocked down. What's important is how many times you get up. Or to be more precise, how many times he gets you back up. And thank God that his mercies are new every morning. And you know how this story ends. After denying Jesus, Peter gives it up, goes north back to Galilee. And the resurrected Jesus hunts him down in Galilee to call him to feed his sheep and to forgive him. Peter's story is the story of redemption. Peter's story is our story. But back to keys or cross or both. I believe it's very important not to see this as an either or, because as I've experienced it over the years, I've seen real damage done by ones who emphasize one or the other. When your focus is only on the keys, then everything comes about how much authority you have, and then leaders tend to lord over people or take advantage of them. Over the years, I've seen a number of groups and churches that started out with the very best and purest of intentions. And before long, because of this focus on authority, they become cult-like. The leaders begin to think more of themselves than they ought to think. And I've also seen it where too much focus on the keys of the kingdom or the authority of the church turns into almost a kind of magical thinking. I read a blog of a guy who identified himself as a Pentecostal Anglican. He calls himself a priest. And he wrote that he was really disappointed in the church's response to the recent hurricane in Texas, because the church didn't get together and command the hurricane to miss Texas. Where were we commanded to miss? Louisiana? I mean, and then he even went back to when Pat Robertson did that, supposedly when he protected it from hitting Virginia in the 700 Club, ignoring the fact that it did land in New York and cause a lot of damage. So it's not very Christian to me to pray, "Lord, please let this thing miss my house, but I'm okay if you hit the neighbors." What are the keys then? The keys are not given to the church to turn us into the great and powerful Oz. It is an expression of binding and loosing. It's actually a rabbinic expression, so the disciples would have understood perfectly what Jesus was talking about. It has to do with retaining someone's sin or loosing someone from their sins. We see this as early as the Old Testament, when the priest would lay his hands on the scapegoat and impute the sins of the people to the goat and then drive the goat out to the wilderness. In this way, he was loosing the people from their sins. The church uses these keys to bind and loose today. We do it in several ways. First and foremost, through the proclamation of the gospel. That's the greatest way to loose people from their sins, because Jesus, who is the truth, makes people free, sets people free by freeing them from guilt and shame and condemnation and ultimately from the final judgment. But second, we as Anglicans experience the keys when we are absolved after the general confession, which will happen in a few moments in the Mass, or in a private confession. I'm sure my brother priest will agree with me that in that moment when the priest stands and puts a hand on someone and proclaims Christ's forgiveness, it is an intensely holy moment. And honestly, I never do this without also just a touch of holy fear. But it's followed by the joy of seeing the monkey come off somebody's back. A third way the church uses the keys to the kingdom are through the very sacraments themselves. The body and blood of Christ are given to us as we pray that our sinful bodies may be made clean by your body and our souls washed through his most precious blood. That's what the keys are for. But they can't be overemphasized or you get into trouble. The opposite is also true. I've seen some very bad fruit come out of those who only focus on the cross. Years ago, I knew a Bible teacher whose constant message was, we need to be broken. We have to be broken. And so he encouraged people to embrace suffering at every turn and to use it to break them. Every time you had a problem, every time you were faced a challenge, he saw it as an opportunity to be further broken. And not only that, but he warned people not to have too much joy. He went so far as to say, if you love something or someone too much, the Lord will take it away from you to break you, including your child or your spouse. Let me tell you, this is not a guy you want to invite to a party, right? I mean, he was like a little cloud walking around. And yet, when you read the New Testament and see how saints and sinners alike were with Jesus, they loved hanging around Jesus. Which tells me that this guy was telling a different story about God than the story Jesus was telling about God. When we only focus on the cross, like this Bible teacher did, we forget that as important as Good Friday is, we are an Easter people. We're to walk in the life of the resurrection. So what I'm suggesting, therefore, is the keys and the cross are not an either or, they're a both and. And as you've probably already deduced, they are a perfect balance for one another. If you only focus on the keys, you end up being like a televangelist theology. If you only focus on the cross, you drag around life like a living martyr filled with self-contempt. Jesus does tell us to take up our cross, but he also says that he came to give us life and life abundantly. And those are not mutually exclusive. There's a wonderful collect in the Book of Common Prayer and Morning Prayer on Fridays that says, mercifully grant that we, walking in the way of the cross, may find it none other than the way of life and peace. So then the next question is, how do we take up our cross? How do we go about walking in the way of the cross? I think there's probably a lot of answers to that, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to surpass what St. Paul commands us in Romans. Present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. The cross is an instrument of death. When we take up our cross, we die. Being a sacrifice is offering oneself for death. And so to take up our cross is also to be a living sacrifice. And as he is in all things, Jesus is our perfect model here. He made it quite clear he did not come to do his own will. He said this, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. And then you recall him praying in the garden, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. This is how he lived his life as a living sacrifice until he literally became the Lamb of God that took away the sins of the world. Okay, but let's take this a step further. How do you present your body as a living sacrifice when you've got kids to get to school, flights to catch, doctor's appointment to make? I mean, it was pretty clear Mother Teresa was taking up her cross daily, but none of us are Mother Teresa, likely never will be. So how do you do this? I believe it begins with an attitude of your heart. As you begin each day, do as Jesus did and proclaim that you are here to do the Father's will. I boiled this down in my own life to a childlike simplicity. Every day after I pray the morning office, I say, Lord, I want to be your servant. I want to go where you want me to go. I want you to meet who you want me to meet. I want to say what you want me to say. And I want you to do what you want me to do. And then I just go about my normal day, looking for Him to answer that prayer. Someone once said to me, it seems like the more I pray, the more coincidences happen. I've discovered the more you pray that, the more it gets answered. And they're really not coincidences, they're divine appointments. And for me, the beauty of this simplistic approach is you don't have to go through the day wondering, am I in the will of God? Am I out of the will of God? I hope I'm doing God's will. You've offered your day and your life to Him at the beginning of the day as a living sacrifice. And you trust Him that if He wants you somewhere else, He has the power to get you somewhere else. He's mindful that we're but dust, right? So I don't have to worry about guilt about I'm not doing God's will. I'm the dirt ball. He's the Creator, and so He gets me where He needs me to be if I'll submit to Him at the beginning of the day. Another practical suggestion I want to give to you comes out of something that I had to work through in my own life. I had an uncle named Bubba, surprisingly, who lived in Asheville, North Carolina, and Bubba was convinced that preachers only work one day a week and just a half a day at that, so they've got a really good job. But most folks who know clergy know that we are on call 24/7. So my concern was, how do I know when my day is done? How can I tell when it is time to put down today's cross so that I can prepare myself to pick up tomorrow's cross? I believe that one of the stats that I didn't want to become of, 80% of ordained clergy do not make it past 5 years. And I believe the inability to know when to turn it on and when to turn it off, when to lay down your cross and when to pick it up is one of the reasons guys burn out so badly, and I didn't want to become a statistic. So how do I do this? Through prayer it came to me that I should measure my day not by time, but by deeds, like we prayed in the collect today, that we would have the fruit of good works. So I realized I could lay down my cross daily if I accomplished a minimum of 3 significant good works that in some way furthered the kingdom that day. So for example, if I meet with the clergy to plan for St. Patrick's, I do some individual marital counseling, I take the sacrament to someone in the hospital, the day will continue and I'll have answered emails and phone calls and other meetings and stuff, but having accomplished 3 things that I think significantly push toward the kingdom, by the end of the day I could take off my cleats and hang them up without guilt. If something like that would work for you, to take up your cross this way by making a goal of maybe a good deed every day, realize though, but because our lives are so different from each other, no life is going to look alike, and so therefore your standards will not be the same as each other's. You may find that between your family and your job and football practice and everything else going on in the world, you would do well to find one significant thing you could do each day to further the kingdom. That doesn't sound like a lot, but think about this for a moment. If you do it for God's glory, and if you do it every day, day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, year in, year out, you will have an impact on this world. And I have no doubt that at the end of the day you will hear these words, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master. There's a second part of this that St. Paul calls us to in terms of living sacrifices, and that is his command, quote, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Thus we take up our cross by not being conformed to this world. Now this is not a call to create a list of legalistic rules and things that you have to avoid. This is a calling to think and act differently from the people of this world. For example, he'll say in the later in this chapter, to not think more highly of yourself than you should. In other words, to avoid pride. He says, do not repay evil for evil. That could have been taken right out of this week's news. The recent insanity of the Antifa thugs fighting against neo-Nazis and KKKers are living proof right before our eyes what happens to you when you're filled with pride and that evil fighting against evil accomplishes absolutely nothing. We succeed in not being conformed to this world when we think and act like people of his kingdom. And so St. Paul says if your enemy is hungry, you feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So I see here Jesus giving the apostles both the keys and the cross. And I believe he does a similar thing to each of us as his disciples. He has given us his Spirit to be his co-workers. And at the same time, he calls us to die to self. But he does this not as a form of punishment. He does this because he knows that dying to self, above all he knows this, that the way of the cross is the way of life and peace. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.